Watch this.
Over the years here on 208, we've introduced you to dozens of Idahoans from all different eras and walks of life. Some who walked 15 miles up the backcountry in deep snow just to get a dance, and another who married into what eventually would become one of the most recognizable names in the world. We'll tell you about both of those women in just a moment, but we start with a young girl who would eventually change the way the United States Postal Service worked. The same year, Idaho became an official territory of the United States. 1863, the U.S. Post Office began what they called Free City Delivery Service. It meant mail would be delivered to city residents for free. That same idea was considered for country folk in 1890, the same year Idaho became a state. At the time, they had to come to town to get their letters, but it wasn't until 1899 that free delivery of mail was offered on rural routes across the country. Came to Idaho a year later. It wasn't long before those that lived way out of town wanted a way to get goods, larger items delivered right to their door, stuff that couldn't be stuffed in an envelope. So the United States Post Office began a post-parcel delivery that made it possible to send something bigger than a bread box to the same spot as someone's mailbox. And boy, did people send stuff. Not that there were, not rules, weight limits, liquid limits, standards for seeds and salves, but you know what wasn't considered unmailable matter? Man, more specifically, a man or woman's child. One of the most well-known instances of that happened right here in Idaho. In 1914, a little girl from Grangeville was sent to see her grandmother by the mail.
Mail service in Idaho in the early 1900s was a relevant resource of the rural community to stay connected to the outside world. But when the U.S. Post Office made parcel delivery a permanent part of their service in 1913, it also became a means to move materials.
Folks were just trying to be innovative and use this new service to the ability that they could. And in a way, they were really kind of pushing the limit.
The weight limit of what could be sent was also pushed, increasing 3 times that year, from 4 to 50 pounds. And people took advantage.
There was actually a story in Salt Lake where there was a gentleman who was trying to build a bank, and he ended up mailing over 40 tons of bricks over about a 150-mile radius because it was cheaper than just putting them on the train.
That sidestep the train ticket mentality led to other peculiar parcels perceived by parents. Oh yeah, people passed their kids along with the postman. 7 times between 1913 and 1915, according to the National Postal Museum. One of those times was one of the last.
She is known as Mailing May, a little girl that was shipped through the mail, through the postage system.
5-year-old Charlotte May Piersdorf lived in Grangeville, Idaho. Her grandmother lived in Lewiston, but getting them together would cost too much by train.
It was nearly 3 times as expensive to buy her a train ticket as it was to buy the postage to mail her to Lewiston.
So that's what they did. On February 19th, 1914, May Piersdorf was sent packing, sort of, with postage pinned to her coat.
53 cents.
To mail a child.
Excuse me, a parcel. And just a shade shy of the 50-pound limit.
Miss May was able to go through the post because she weighed 48.5 pounds.
Oh, Miss May still made the 73-mile commute on the Camas Prairie Railroad, just in the mail compartment instead of the passenger part. So yes, there was a time when kids could be considered live cargo.
If you could figure out a way to box it, you could probably figure out a way to ship it.
Or at least attach postage to their coat.
Exactly.
Just so happened, May's mother's cousin was the postal clerk who accompanied the little girl to Lewiston, so she wasn't alone. And it wasn't easy. The curvy tracks made May nauseous, so she stuck her head out the door to get some air. The train conductor saw her, and word of her journey made it back to the U.S. postmaster, who shortly after instituted a rule about the mail that stands to this day. No humans allowed. And that didn't stop people from doing it for a few years after, though, but May's may have been the most famous. There was even a children's book written about it. It's called Mailing May. From Mailing May to another influential Idaho girl, April 3rd is a significant day of the 1A, otherwise known as Ada County. It's the birthday of the county namesake, Ada Riggs. More than 165 years ago, she became the oldest daughter of what would become one of Boise's first settlers. She was just 7 years old when she moved here, and we thought things moved quickly these days. Within a year and a half of living in Boise, she had a county named after her. There's not a whole lot known about Ada, but her father certainly left a legacy, which is where the story of Ada begins, with her father, H.C. Henry Chills Riggs.
By the time he made it to Boise, Henry Riggs had been a soldier, a statesman, a spouse, a sire of 3 kids, and sort of unsettled, having gone from his birthplace of Kentucky to Missouri, to California, back to Missouri, back to California, then to Oregon, and finally what would become the city of Boise in July 1863. He claimed to have pitched the first tent in town, giving him the title of founder, or at least one of them. Riggs then helped lay out the center of the city as we know it today. It wasn't long till he was elected territorial legislator, where he is most remembered for 2 bills. One, moving the territory capital from Lewiston to Boise. The other, creating a new county carved out of the existing Boise County and centered around, you guessed it, the city of Boise. They were going to call it Riggs County, naturally, but Henry had a better idea. He suggested naming it after his 8-year-old daughter, Ada. And so it was. And on December 22nd, 1864, Ada County was formally formed, and therefore established the eternal question, why is Boise not in Boise County?
Oh, one other thing Henry did for Idaho. In 1870, he got a shipment from Missouri, 2 crates filled with 38 quail. They were sent to several spots across the territory, thus giving Henry Riggs the credit of introducing quail to Idaho. Henry and his wife, the former Mary Ann Lipscomb, also of Kentucky, had 8 kids in all, 4 of which were born in Boise. The youngest born in Emmett on the family homestead. Both Henry, who died in 1909, and Mary Ann, who died 3 years later, they are buried in Emmett to this day. Ada Riggs was not a longtime resident of Idaho. She married in Caldwell in 1884 to John Riggs Kuhn. They moved to California, where Ada lived until passing away in San Francisco in 1909, the same year as her father. A myth of Ada Riggs persistently repeated was that she was the first pioneer or white child born in the area, thus giving the naming of the county after her some sort of heft. It's not true. Ada Riggs was born in Davis, California in 1856. As I'm sure will sit well with longtime residents, the creation of Ada County will forever be connected to a California native. It's not just the people of Idaho we've covered, but the animals too, like the beavers who went skydiving in the backwoods of McCall in the 1940s and 50s, and a fearless feline who became friends with some of Idaho's most dangerous men and women. That's coming up after the break.
Animals 800. In the 1950s, Idaho relocated these amphibious rodents by dropping them with parachutes out of airplanes.
Alex, what is a beaver? Amphibious animals falling from the sky. This kind of strange but true piece of Idaho history was showcased on Jeopardy a few years ago. Here on the 208, some of us knew exactly what the late Alex Trebek was talking about, while others were confused by even the thought of parachuting beavers in Idaho. So we did some research. Turns out, city of McCall's population boom in the 1940s had something to do with it.
If you were only told about it, you might not believe it. Like a story passed around campfires from one generation to the next. It goes like this. In Idaho's mountains, tucked beside a sparkling lake, sits McCall. With its views and location, it started to pull people in, and the community starts to grow. Family homes, vacation homes, businesses being built. It was going so well until it wasn't. Shortly after World War II, the town found itself with a problem. Turns out, a colony of beavers who had been in the area for centuries began destroying property with their dam tendencies. Beaver, dam, kind of go hand in hand. They were in a fix, and that needed fixing.
He's in. Careful preparation and knowledge of the beaver's habits has paid off.
So the Idaho Department of Fish and Game decided they were going to relocate the rodents to other more remote parts of Idaho. Although this relocating required a flight plan and actual planes. In 1948, Fish and Game officers test dropped Geronimo, their guinea pig, if you will, several times, by box, into Idaho's backcountry.
Into the drop box, nearly ready for that flight back into the mountain.
And it worked. It became the mode of operation to move 75 other members of Geronimo's Beaver Brotherhood. The purpose of this parachuting program? To actually raise the beaver population, while also helping preserve Idaho's habitat. While that was more than 50 years ago, it's still remembered today in remnants in the form of stickers on the front of t-shirts and told in children's books.
Think those 40 pounds of fur were a bit disoriented with that displacement? Only in Idaho. And that film only recently resurfaced, by the way. Fish and Game told us they had known about it for a while, but had no idea where it was until it popped up in 2015. So they posted it all, 14 minutes of it, and it has nearly 630,000 views on YouTube. They don't quite do it like that anymore, though. Fish and Game are transplanting beavers to the Owyhee Desert without the box and shoot in the plains. The hope is for the rodents to help in restoration where water has stripped the vegetation. Isn't that the kind of thing that beavers do? Well, they know what they're doing. From the backwoods of McCall to the dusty desert of East Boise, as the story goes. Sometime in June of 1952, an inmate came in the Old Idaho State Penitentiary through Gate 2, the industrial part of the yard, near where the license plate factory was located. He was carrying a box, and gave that box to another inmate. And in that box was a cat that would soon be called Dennis. Legend has it, Dennis was born on the prison chicken farm on Memorial Day, May 30th that year. And after he was pirated into the pen a couple of weeks later, he spent 16 years as the unofficial pet of the prison. Dennis likely got his name from the prisoner who snuck him in, but the name of that prisoner? Still unknown. What is known is the impact left by a long-haired tomcat, and it's why the Old Idaho Pen still celebrates his birthday.
It started as the Territorial Prison in 1872, a rather rough house in those early days. But by the early 1950s,
the
Old Idaho State Penitentiary had mellowed, mostly, but it was also expanding.
They were working on building number 4 house and the maximum security building. Number 4 house, number 5 house were built by the prisoners just like all the other buildings. And so there was unrest surrounding the amount of work that they had to do and the small amount of leisure time that they had.
I would expect that any sort of distraction was welcomed.
Exactly. You welcome distraction and you know, a bit of levity in a place, you know, doesn't have a lot of levity.
Enter Dennis the cat. In June of 1952, a prisoner serving a life sentence smuggled the black tomcat into House 2.
Sure, there's a no pet policy, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they had been keeping him secret. They had been keeping him hidden. They'd been sneaking him snacks, sneaking him food.
Of course, it wasn't long before the guards discovered Dennis, and then the warden got wind of him, who would only allow Dennis to stay if the convicts could keep their cool. A caveat that didn't carry on too long, because Dennis knew to make friends with the right people.
You know, the guards became attached to him. All of a sudden they're opening gates for him. All of a sudden they're, you know, letting him in and out of the site, letting him come and go as he pleases, you know, which any other resident of the site would not be able to do.
Cats in this clink was not a new thing, but the others were here on a labor detail to keep mice out of the dining hall.
So what makes Dennis so special?
What makes Dennis so special is the fact that he was referred to more as a pet than a mouser. There's plenty of affection for all the other cats, but Dennis was seen as more of a comfort animal. He lived in the barber shop rather than the dining hall. He had a bed on the barber shop counter, and he was also known as someone who really attached to the life termers. It's almost like he knew that they were going to be here a long time and needed that comfort in order to get him through it.
And Dennis was here a long time too. 16 years, as the legend goes.
He was born on May 30th, 1952 and passed away on May 30th, 1968.
The inmates honored Dennis with a full-fledged funeral. And according to the prison newspaper, there wasn't a dry eye in the yard.
No one was joking around that day. No one was making a snide comment about the amount of reverence they were treating this.
Which is why every year on May 30th, they continue the annual custom of commemorating a dead cat.
Why keep this story alive, like by celebrating a birthday of a cat?
Because it is an example of the shared humanity of the folks who were here and the compassion that is demonstrated by people who are experiencing the, you know, most likely the worst period of their lives. There's a lot of sentiment attached to Dennis's story.
There was a penitentiary cemetery back then. It was at the edge of the number 2 yard, we are told, but it was mostly a potter's field for prisoners where residents would be buried who went unclaimed by family. That was not a fitting fate for Dennis the cat. The prisoners made it a point of saying he was claimed. He had a family on the inside, which is why, as far as Old Penn historians know, Dennis was the only resident buried within the yard. Still, more to come on this special edition of the 208, including how an Idaho woman influenced the naming of one of the most iconic cartoon characters of all time. July 13th, not normally a date that sparks memories. In 1985, it was the first Live Aid rock concert. In 1960, it was the day JFK was nominated for president. In 1930, it was the start of the first World Cup soccer tournament. 98 years ago, Walter Elias Disney married his wife, Lillian Marie Bounds. What does that have to do with the 208 at all? Well, it may not have all started with the mouse, but that's a pretty big part of it.
From the single star to the tip of the castle, you know when you started watching a Disney-made movie. But did you know the man, Walt, and his wife started their lives together in North Idaho? Well, apparently a lot of people did.
Bits and pieces of it have always been out there, but it was such common knowledge, nobody thought it was special.
July 13th, 1925. Walt Disney said, "I do," to Spalding, Idaho-born Lillian Marie Bounds in Lewiston. However, it wasn't a traditional church ceremony.
So where were they married?
They were actually married at her brother's home.
You see, Lewiston is pretty close to Lapwai, which is where Lillian grew up.
It was kind of a private wedding. They didn't have a big, it was just family and a few close friends.
But what brought Walt to the LC Valley? Well, the story goes like this.
She was a well-educated woman before she ever met him.
Lillian left Lewiston Business College after about a year in 1923, after her sister Hazel offered the promise of a job in Southern California.
Yeah, the studio. She got a job at the studio.
The Walt Disney Studio, for $15 a week to color frames of film. I'll let local Lewiston historian Steve Branting tell how Lillian took notice of Walt taking notice of her.
He had a new car, and he would offer to take the girls in the inking department, whoever was working there, he would give them a ride home. She soon started to realize that even though she lived closest to the studio, she was the last one to be dropped off. So they decided to get married. It came back, took the train, came back to Lewiston, and got married at her brother's home.
That home at 918 3rd Street still stands and still looks almost identical to how it did then.
It's an old craftsman home, dates from, the early 20s. That's the neighborhood. It's 20s and 30s neighborhood.
Well, it didn't take long for Lillian to put her imprint into one of America's most iconic cartoons. She actually came up with the name Mickey.
He wanted to call it Mortimer. And she felt that was too old-fashioned. It just didn't have the flavor of being joyous. Mortimer is an old fogey name.
So what other Idaho influence can you find in the wonderful world of Disney? Remember that open? Well, forget about it.
To everyone who sees it says, that's got to be the Lewis-Clark Valley.
Of course.
It's not.
What?
It's not. I've talked to the archives. They've talked to the people who put the films together. They put the introductions, the editors, and they say, it's just a mishmash of all that imagery of river and a valley and the beautiful scenery and a bridge. And it just coincidentally happens to look like it because they didn't live here. And when Lillian grew up here, the valley didn't look like that.
But you have to acknowledge that there's a similarity, though, right? The rivers and the...
A lot of people have looked at it and they want to see Lewiston, and that's okay.
But it's not true.
It wasn't done about Lewiston, no.
She was known as the pistol-packing Madame, according to her story told by local author Bob Love. But she was also known for her survival of a snowstorm, albeit not completely, which is why she is also known as Pegleg Annie.
They left home on a Friday, in spite of the storm rolling round.
So begins the folk song about an Idaho mining and mountain folk, Felicia Ann McIntyre Morrow.
Bottle of whiskey, the plan to go dancing in town.
But who would become better known as Pegleg Annie. The song begins there, but Annie's story doesn't. Annie was born on September 13th, 1858. When her mother died just after delivery, Annie and her brother were raised by her father, Stephen, and his second wife. They moved to Idaho in 1864. where a partnership in the Golden Star mine led to her father being shot dead in the street by that partner, leaving Annie alone at the age of 16. A year later, in 1876, she was married to Thomas Murrow, a man twice her age. Annie gave birth to 5 kids, but Thomas was apparently abusive, so Annie left him and the kids. Desperate to make it on her own, Annie dabbled in saloon dancing, which eventually led to owning brothels in the boomtowns of Rocky Bar and Atlanta. And that's where we get to the peg leg part of the saga.
18 miles to walk in those steep mountain roads.
As the song and the story goes, in 1896, after more than a few shots of whiskey, Annie and a friend, a fellow lady of the night known as Dutch M, decided to walk from Atlanta to Rocky Bar to go to a dance. A march of more than 15 mountainous miles. Even though it was May, a late spring storm rolled in and dumped snow for 2 days. Not properly dressed, the 2 women struggled. Dutch M didn't make it. Annie was carried back to Atlanta 3 days later with severely frostbitten feet. Both had to be amputated. Done with dancing, Annie then went to work doing laundry for the miners of Rocky Bar while wearing woolen pads over her stumps, making money and a name for herself in the process. Pegleg Annie passed away from cancer on her 76th birthday, September 13th, 1934. She's buried in Morris Hill Cemetery in Boise, next to her husband.
Yeah, you and Dutch M can move on again and dance your troubles away.
There are so many more stories to tell, so stay tuned. We'll tell them in the future. Thanks for joining us here on the 208. We'll see you next time.